A very good evening to all of you. Hope you're keeping well and taking good care of yourself and your family members. During this lockdown period, it is good if we keep ourselves occupied. Doordarshan is keeping our elders occupied, and these webinars are keeping us occupied, which is a very good thing. It is keeping us from the worries of all the corona statistics and helping us to update our knowledge. So, with this idea, we are again here with a mind stimulating panel discussion on how to optimize IUI results. Myself, Dr. Tanu Batra, presently working with Indra IVF Jaipur, would be moderating this session. So, let me take the opportunity to introduce our panelists, our rational thinkers. They are Dr. Alka, Head Training, Clinical Research and Audit from Udaipur, Dr. Rashmi Kumar from Raipur, Dr. Manisha Bhagat from Jammu, and Dr. Akanksha Jangir from Calcutta. So, a warm welcome to all our panelists who are charged this evening to defend, define, and describe IUI, which is a very popular technique among many of our gynecologists. As we all know that IUI is a simple, safe, ideal, first choice and most cost-effective ART technique in managing infertility. But it demands patience and motivation on part of both the patient and the treating doctor. It was introduced 200 years ago in 1770 by John Hunter. And this technique, on a lighter note, we can say, as normal delivery is to cesarean section, so is IUI to IVF in infertility. Now, the rationale behind doing IUI is deposition of a good number of highly motile and morphologically normal sperms in the uterus near the fundus at the anticipated time of ovulation. So, it increases the pregnancy rate up to 10 to 15% from the pregnancy rate which is found in natural planning. Now, revisiting IUI, today we are going to study IUI step by step so that we know clearly what is the evaluation, what are the prerequisites of IUI, so that we can make a careful evaluation and selection of the patient, choose the right technique, choose the right protocol, and go ahead to get the maximum success rate. So now I'll be starting with my first case that is very commonly seen in our OPD practice. Now she's a young female, 24-year-old with primary infertility, married for 4 years with regular cycles. AFC is 7 to 8 follicles on both the sides. The patient had patent tubes on HSG. She has taken 3 cycles of clomiphene and there is documented evidence of ovulation in all the cycles. Husband semen analysis within normal limits. So what next? My this question goes to Dr. Alka. Dr.
Very
Alka?
good evening to all of you.
Hi.
As per your case presentation, I feel this is a young couple who's having unexplained infertility. And Dr. Tanu, I'm not very sure whether this lady has taken only clomiphene citrate and she has planned for timed intercourse or she has undergone IUIs already.
No, she
So,
had planned for timed intercourse, not gone for IUI.
okay. So then let me put this that there is no place of time intercourse in unexplained infertility in modern day practice. So if this lady has already taken clomiphene and documented ovulation is there, and if her endometrium is fine, then I would prefer using another cycle with clomiphene, or you can replace the drug with letrozole, and she should be planned with IUI rather than time intercourse. And if the couple is very anxious, then we have to counsel them, and then we'll have to choose the right protocol. But as per the history you have given me, I would like to go with another cycle of clomiphene and plan IUI with that.
According to you, how many cycles of CC we can give continuously? Are there any guidelines?
Yeah, sure. We all know that we should not be using CC for more than 12 in the whole lifetime, and not more than 6 cycles at one go.
All right. Yeah, I perfectly agree with you, Dr. Alka. There have been guidelines time to time presented to us. One of the guidelines is the NICE guidelines, which state that do not routinely offer IUI with or without stimulation for unexplained and mild endometriosis or mild male factor. they directly say that go for IVF in those couples who have not conceived after 2 years of regular unprotected intercourse or expectant management. But on the contradictory, there is another ASRM guidelines which state that the best initial therapy is a course of 3 to 4 cycles of ovarian stimulation and IUI, either with clomiphene or letrozole, followed by IVF for those couples who are unsuccessful in achieving a pregnancy. So I agree with you that the best thing is to go with IUI. But then how do we decide at what time we should move forward for IUI? Means like the NICE guidelines say that after 2 years you should go for IVF. So to solve this, there is a important prediction model which is the Hunal score. This model, it helps us to calculate the chance of spontaneous ongoing pregnancy among the subfertile couples, and it is an essential tool as it can help us to avoid unnecessary events. But it is unreliable if there is no proper ovulation, if the tubes are blocked, if there is a severe male factor, or if the age is more than 38 years, or the duration of infertility is less than 1 year. So it can be a very useful tool in deciding when should we go forward for the IUI. Now, this is the Hunal's prediction score, which I would like to tell that if the scoring is less than 30%, means if there is a chance of getting pregnant within 1 year is less than 30%, then it is best that we go with 3 cycles of IUI with or without stimulation. And if the chance of conception is more than 30% in a year's time, it is better that we wait for 6 months to 1 year time. Now, again, if we decide to go with stimulation with IUI, now we have to decide whether it is mild male factor or moderate. If it is a mild male factor infertility, we can go ahead with stimulation. And if it is moderate, if the count is less than 10 million, then IUI and natural cycle is preferred. Okay, so now I move forward to what are the indications of IUI. Dr. Rashmi?
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Rashmi from Indira IVF Raipur. Talking about the indications of IUI, it is female factors. In the male factors, if the patient has ejaculated dysfunction, hypospadias, retrograde ejaculation parameters, or for hereditary disease. For the female factors, if there is ovulatory dysfunction with mild male factor infertility, there is mild endometriosis, explain infertility. These are the indications for IUI in which the patient will benefit most from the IUI.
Yes, rightly said. Even in cases of HIV positive partners, there also we suggest for IUI. And there have been studies which state that proper washing can decrease the transmission risk up to just 4.5 per 10,000. So which is a very good number, which tells us that IUI is safe in cases of HIV couples also. All right. So now I move to the second question. Now, it's a very interesting case. A young female with regular cycles and history of ectopic pregnancy, twice, affecting both the tubes, but it was managed medically. Recent HSG shows bilateral patent tubes. She's trying to conceive since past 2 years, but she didn't conceive. So shall we proceed for IUI? Dr. Manisha, this question is for you.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Manisha from Jammu Center. So Dr. Tanu, according to the question, the patient has a history of ectopic pregnancy and that too which has affected both the tubes. So it indicates a severe tubal factor infertility. In these patients, IUI is not indicated. See, if a patient has one ectopic pregnancy, the chance of a recurrence is around 10 to 15%, and it rises to as high as 25 to 27% if it has been the ectopic has been there twice. So in this case, I would not like to go in for an IUI, and even the studies have indicated that in these kind of patients, if IVF is available, that should be offered to the patient. And in IVF also, you need to take precautions, like if the patient becomes pregnant, then you need to do an ultrasound early to confirm whether it is an ectopic or whether it's an intrauterine pregnancy.
I agree with you, Dr. Manisha, that here it is a good decision if we go for IVF. But here going for IVF just to reduce the chances of ectopic, I would not agree. Because here the patient has been trying since past 2 years. She's not been conceiving. So the probable cause is that maybe the tubes are patent in HSG, but they are not functionally good. So here, then we can choose for IVF. And as you said, I agree with you that proper counseling is required. We have to tell the patient that there is a chance of recurrence, and we have to be very vigilant and do strict monitoring. Okay, so what are the contraindications for doing IUI? Dr. Akanksha?
Thank you, Dr. Danu, for the question. About the contraindications of IUI, I would say the patients who have severe pelvic adhesions, like the patients who have and the patients who have grade 3, grade 4 endometriosis. These patients should not be advised IUI. Reason being, for IUI we need a normal tubo-ovarian relationship, which is lost in these patients. So I would not advise IUI to the patients with severe pelvic adhesions or grade 3 or grade 4 endometriosis. The second category comes the patients who have bilateral tubal pathology, just like the one in the previous question. The patient who is having recurrent ectopics or the patient who has documented hydrosalpinx on HSG, they should not be advised IUI. The third category is the patient who has severe male factor infertility. IUI, the success of IUI is very, very poor in patients who have severe oligoacinic teratozoospermia, and these patients should be directly advised IVF. The fourth category of patients are the one who have severe cervical stenosis, in whom we are not able to negotiate IUI catheter. In them, the cervical factor should be dealt first, and then decision should be made for the treatment. And the last category, I would say, is a little bit controversial, which is older women. That is the women who are more than 40 years of age. In these patients, I would not say that it is absolutely contraindicated, but I would say that IUI should be advised very cautiously in these patients, considering other associated factors of infertility like poor ovarian reserve also.
Yes, I agree with you, Dr. Akanksha. We sometimes get many patients who are older than 39, 40 years, and they are willing to go for IUI. In fact, sometimes they come with the prescription to go for IUI as referred cases. So here's is a very interesting case, again on the same topic. A 41-year-old woman wishes to become pregnant using donor insemination. Her general medical history is unremarkable. She gets regular cycle every 26 to 28 days. 1 MTP at 22 years age by DNC. AFC was 4 and AMH was 1 nanogram per ml. So what next? So here I would like to ask Dr. Alka, would you say that we still have time considering 40 as the old age of youth or 50 as the youth of old age? Or hurry up with your decisions? What do you say, Dr. Alka?
First of all, I'll say that you have asked a very practical and tricky question in this forum, which is meant to be, solving these kind of puzzles. So we all know, we agree though that IUI is the most popular assisted reproductive method used. And it is quite simple, safe, but that doesn't mean that we don't think before offering IUI to a patient. According to me personally, this particular patient, I would not even think of IUI. I would try to counsel her in details that her age is racing against her, and she is perfectly a candidate to go for IVF directly, and her AFC is already 4, so she is going for diminished ovarian reserve. Even with IVF, she will have more chances of aneuploidies. So definitely we should not delay things anymore, so that she loses all the chances to have a pregnancy with her own eggs. So definitely for me, a 41 years old lady, even if she comes to me with this mindset of IUI, I would preferably try to counsel her that she should go for IVF directly.
Yes, I agree, because all the infertility specialists are very conscious and cautious. All right, so there are 2 RCTs also which support the same evidence. They are the FORT and the FAST trial. The FORT trial says that superior pregnancy rates with fewer cycles in the immediate IVF group than IUI with COH cycles. That is, it is good if we go for immediate IVF cycles and we have good results. Whereas the FAST trial said that if the FSH is greater than 10 to 15 milli international unit per ml, or E2 is greater than 40 picogram per ml on day 3, then it is useless going with ovarian stimulation in IUI. As the ASRM says, that the treatment becomes futile if these are the FSH and the E2 are raised. So it is of no value going with the stimulation with IUI. It is best that we go forward with IVF, keeping in consideration the timing of pregnancy. All right. So what are the prerequisites of IUI, Dr. Rashmi? What things should we keep in mind before taking the patient for IUI?
Yeah, the basic investigations for the female and male should be done. For female, the tubes should be patent, or at least one tube should be patent, and we should carefully monitor during the stimulation that the side of the tube which is open, that side only if the ovulation is happening, then we should proceed with the IUI, otherwise not. Secondly, subnormal semen parameters should be there. If it is severely oats or something like that, we should not take them patient. There should not be any ovulatory dysfunction. There should not be any uterine factor. All these things should be first ruled out, and then only we should take the patient for the IUI. There should be also a focus on the ovarian reserve. Like in previous question, we discussed that the AFC and ovarian reserve should also be seen and monitored accordingly.
Okay. And you've mentioned about the semen parameters also. That also semen analysis has to be done before we.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Okay. So now the next question are, what are the minimum basic equipments needed for setting of an IUI lab? Dr. Manisha?
So IUI is a procedure in which the success also depends on the person who is doing it, the place we are doing it, and kind of equipments we are using. If the lab is good, it is contamination free, and it is microbiologically tested, and we are using good consumables in our labs, we'll get good results. If you look at the place, it should be done. It's a primary 1B clinic, which should be registered with the State Medical Council. And if you're doing an ultrasound, a PCPNDT license has to be taken. If you look at the equipments, the basic requirements for an IUI lab are, first, you need to have a binocular microscope, a Mechler chamber to count the count and motility, then a vertical laminar flow hood, where you can do the semen preparation, a sperm centrifugation machine where you will centrifuge the sperm. An incubator need not be a CA2 incubator, a normal incubator which maintains the temperature will do. Then you require the pipettes, the test tubes, which could be round bottom or conical. Then you require the media, the pure sperm or the flushing media. And if you are doing donor insemination, then cryopans are also required. And basically containers which are non-toxic to sperms should be used. Because ultimately, if you are using good things, you will get good quality of sperm preparations and better pregnancy rates.
Yes, and we got to maintain the consent forms also.
Yeah, that is very important.
Yeah.
For consent forms, you need to keep the records for 10 years. And
That's
if the lab in between closes, then you need to send those forms to ICMR, which will keep it for 10 years.
All right. Dr. Manisha, one of my friends, she wants to set up the IUI lab in her nursing home. So how much will be an expenditure for that?
Okay.
Rough estimate.
Okay, if we are taking the normal incubator, we are somewhere looking around 1.6 to 2 lakhs. If they want to have a lab in their own nursing home or setup, wherever they are doing.
All right. Okay, now we come across a very interesting case. There's a young couple married for 3 years on expectant management till now. The male partner has mild factor infertility. They were counseled to go for IUI for the first time. Now, in this case, would you prefer to go with natural cycle IUI or stimulated one? Because it has been diagnosed that there is mild male factor. So, Dr. Akanksha, what would be your choice?
Okay. So, Dr. Danu, I want to say that IUI in this case is going to work in two manners. First is by increasing the number of eggs available for fertilization. And second is by increasing the sperm density near the fertilization site. So for this case, ovarian stimulation is an important part of IUI. So I will go for a stimulated cycle rather than a natural cycle IUI.
Okay. And would you use oral ovulogens or would you prefer the combination of oral ovulogens and gonadotropins?
Okay. So keeping in mind the success of the protocol and the cost incurred to the patient, I would go only with the oral agents, because as per I would like to give the reference of the latest ASRM guidelines, which have been published in 2020 only. The success rate associated with oral agents like letrozole and clomiphene are more or less comparable when we talk about the gonadotropin cycle and the cost associated with these agents is very less. So my choice of drug will be either clomiphene citrate or letrozole.
Yes, I agree with you that it is better to go with oral stimulants which are oral ovulogins. So we try for 3 to 4 cycles. If the patient conceives well and good, if doesn't, then we go for IVF. And best is the choice of oral ovulogins rather than going for gonadotropins. Also, the advantage of stimulated cycles is it increases the number of oocytes available, increases the chance of fertilization, steroid production is increased, which again increases the chance of implantation. It corrects subtle ovulatory disorders such as LUS, and exact time can be determined. But there are certain conditions in which we can also go with unstimulated IUI cycles, such as physical disability and psychosexual problems where we offer IUI, or sperm washings in HIV positive men, or donor semen IUI. All right. So now we come again to another case which is very frequently seen in our OPD practices. A 27-year-old female, married life 4 years, BMI is 29, delayed cycles, A3 FSH is 5, LH is 7, bilateral tubes are patent, HSA is normal. She has tried to get pregnant by using 2 cycles of CC 100 milligrams for 5 days, and then there was no success, so she repeated with a higher dose of 150 milligram without any growth of follicles. Both the ovaries are polycystic with volume 13 cc. So here, what would be the further treatment, Dr. Alka?
So we are encountering clomiphene resistance right now. You know, the lady has been given 100 and 150 2 cycles, and still she has not ovulated. So in these kind of patients, given the present scenario, her BMI is high, and she is showing USG features of polycystic ovaries. And so weight reduction is very, very important. You know, simple funda which I remember in my life, that reducing just 5 kgs of weight will increase ovulation chances by 5%. So definitely we need to do that. And I'm not aware whether she has already been on metformin or not, because in these kind of patients, we must start the patient on metformin. And the role of dexamethasone is also there in many studies, which will help in hyperandrogenic, especially hyperandrogenic PCOS patient will be helped with dexamethasone. So if all these things have been, already adjuvant treatments have already been started, then it's time when we should, switch over the oral ovulogen. Now that CC has been tried, let's try with letrozole. If she is not ovulating with letrozole also, then I would think of, going with gonadotropins. And that too, because gonadotropins is a very easy thing to use for PCOS, especially.
I agree with you. Yes, either metformin or letrozole can be a very good choice. Dr. Rashmi, here I would like to ask that if you add gonadotropins in such patients, then how would you give the gonadotropin dose? Would you like to give a conventional dose or low dose, or would you like to combine gonadotropin with the oral ovulogins?
Ma'am, as we see in the case, this is a clomiphene resistant case. So in such cases, purely gonadotropin, the chronic low dose protocol works best from them, which is given in the form of recombinant FSH 75 IU to be started from day 2 of menses till day 14. We should not change the dose in between. If after 14 days also there is no response, we have to increase the dose by 37.5 IU and give for another 7 days. If still there is no response, we can further increase the dose by 37.5 IU for the further 7 days. But the disadvantage of this process is that it is long, and the cost become a factor. So we have to go according to this.
All right, just a second, please. Okay, as we know that there is a basket of various choices when we begin our stimulation in IUI cycles, whether to use clomiphene or to use gonadotropins or to use letrozole or both combination or only gonadotropins. Friends, here we have to remember one thing, that all expensive things are not good. Simplicity can be a boon. So as we discussed this case, it was a CC resistant case. There has been no growth after 4 cycles. We can change the treatment, and this CC resistant is very commonly seen in obese patients and hyperandrogenemia. Then again, CC failure is where the patient ovulates but does not conceive. And as Dr. Alka has mentioned about all these regimes, they are very good regimes, good alternatives which we can start in CC resistant cases. And in chronic low dose protocol, it ensures us to get a monofollicular development, but here the doctor as well as the patient has to be patient because it can take a prolonged time. Okay, now we come across another interesting case. Suppose we've given stimulation and we've got a beautiful follicle, mature follicle, time to give a trigger. And this is a case scenario in front of you, a 32-year-old female on clomiphene, 11th day of follicular monitoring, two dominant follicles of 18 and 19 mmC, one on each side. The perifollicular vascularity is 1/4 of the follicular circumference. Endometrium thickness is 7 mm. If you want the Doppler readings, then I have it with them. PSP is 10 centimeter per second. Perifollicular RI is 0.3. Endometrial RI is 0.4. And uterine artery PI is 3.1. So would you proceed with trigger or not, Dr. Manisha?
So, Dr. Tanu, in this case, first thing is a patient is on CC, and she has two dominant follicles of 18 and 19 millimeter. Then when it comes down to ET, the thickness is 7 millimeter and perifollicular vascularity is 1/4 of the follicle circumference. In this case, I would not like to trigger now first because the ET is just 7 millimeter. In cases, there has been a lot of trials where it has been shown that if the ET is between 8 to 12 millimeter, the pregnancy rates increase. Secondly, in cases of perifollicular vascularity, it is just 1/4. If you look at this Doppler parameter, it is divided into 4 grades, 1, 2, 3, 4. If it is less than 25%, then that is 1/4. It is grade 1. Between 25 to 50%, it is grade 2. Between 50 to 75%, it is grade 3. And if it is more than 75%, then it is grade 4. And it has been seen that if the perifollicular vascularity is more than 75%, that is grade 4, and PSV is more than 10 centimeter per second, then there is a high chance that we'll get a mature follicle and the pregnancy rates also increases. So in this case, I would like to wait for 1 more day. Secondly, this is clomiphene citrate. In clomiphene citrate, we can wait for trigger till 20 to 24 millimeter. The follicle is 20 to 24 millimeter. And for gonadotrophins, it's 18 to 20 millimeters. So yes, I would like to wait for 1 day for trigger in this patient.
Yes, absolutely right. There have been studies which state that the maximum diameter which gives good result can be between 23 to 28. But few studies also say that the diameter can be between 20 to 20 mm. In CC cycles, the diameter, the maturity is delayed as compared to the gonadotropin cycles. So in CC and letrozole, we can give a trigger between 20 to 22 mm, and in gonadotropins between 18 to 20 mm. Because there are few studies which have mentioned that if we delay to give the trigger beyond 22, then there is a risk of LUS also. And paper published by Dr. Sonal Panchal has also mentioned about the optimal pre-HCG follicular parameters, which I would like to mention. The vascularity should cover at least 3/4 of the follicular circumference. Perifollicular RI should be less than 0.5. PSV should be greater than 10 centimeter per second. Follicular volume should be 3 to 8 cc. Vascularity index should be greater than 6 and flow index should be greater than 35. Whereas the optimal pre-HCG endometrial parameters are, it is good if we have a triple line endometrium pattern of at least 6 mm, preferably 8 mm. Grade AB and endometrium. Endometrial vascularity should be in zone 3 and 4. Endometrial RI should be less than 0.6. Volume should be greater than 2 cc. FI should be greater than 40 and DFI should be greater than 20. Uterine artery pulsatility index should be less than 3.2. So if anybody is doing Doppler, they can take help of these parameters also to determine the optimal time to give the trigger. Now we come to the timing of IUI. You have given the trigger. So what is the ideal time to give trigger? It is 24 hours, 36 or 40 hours. Does this time depend upon the patient's convenience or the doctor convenience? So I want an answer from Dr. Akanksha.
Definitely it depends upon the convenience of both the patient and the doctor, as well as the working hours of the clinic also. So usually what we do is we scan the patient in the morning or afternoon, see a follicle which is 20 to 22 millimeter, plan the HCG trigger in the night, and then call the patient day after tomorrow, that is after 36 to 40 hours, to do the IUI. But this is not a hard and fast rule. If the patient is not able to come day after tomorrow, we can also plan the IUI as early as after 24 hours also. So there's a big window from 24 hours to 40 hours where we can plan the IUI without compromising its success rate.
Okay, and how do we determine? Means, do we use ultrasound with HCG trigger? Is it a good tool? Of course, we've been using. Or would you prefer LH surge in cases of natural IUI cycles, Dr. Alka? What are your views about using LH kits for deciding?
We always monitor our cycles with the ultrasound only. So I don't advocate urinary LH kits. First of all, you know, in India, doing them daily and a lot of false positives are there. So I personally don't advocate using urinary LH kits. But yes, if a patient is staying very far off, is not able to come, some very strict job constraints are there, then we might use them. Otherwise, nothing can beat ultrasound deciding about when to give the trigger and when to do IUI. Generally, I time my IUI depending on the IUSG only, and I call the patient like just now Akansha said, we are also following the same thing, giving trigger in the night and calling the patient day after in the morning for IUI, around 36 to 40 hours after trigger.
But sometimes the patient stays at a remote area and cannot come for ultrasound monitoring and has not taken any stimulation also. So in that case,
yeah, in natural cycle, recommendations are also there that we can use urinary LH to predict ovulation, and that I also mentioned that if the patient is not able to come, and then in that case is fairly good choice. But in my practice, I am generally not using it.
yes, all right, because LH kit has also got many false positive and false negative results. And one thing is very specific about it, that you have to use at a particular time. In the afternoon or evening time, it is advised rather than using it in the morning sample. Okay, as Dr. Akanksha mentioned that once we give HCG, single IUI can be performed anytime between 24 and 40 hours of HCG. The recommendations also say the same thing. An IUI in a natural cycle could be performed one day after LH rise. And it is recommended that a single, this is the latest guideline, ASRM guideline, which states that a single IUI can be performed anytime between 0 and 36 hours related to the HCG injection. Also, there have been Cochrane data which states that there was no significant difference in live birth rate between HCG injection or LH surge, whichever was used for monitoring, urinary HCG and recombinant HCG, and whether IUI was done at 24 hours or 48 hours. So the results were the same. Now we've given the trigger and we have decided for the IUI. So in this case, should we go for single or double IUI? Because sometimes it is in our minds that if we do IUI twice, it can increase the probability. Is it true, Dr. Rashmi?
Many papers are published which shows that there is no much difference between the single and the double IUI. If we are using CC or Letros, in which there is usually monofollicular growth, then single IUI is preferable. Otherwise, only in cases of mild male factor infertility, double IUI is advisable. Otherwise, there is no much significant difference between the two.
Yes, I agree with you. There have been many studies which say that single well-time IUI is better because double IUI, it will increase the cost and the psychological burden. Other than this, there were few studies which stated that double IUI could be useful in some isolated male factor, but though that evidence was very weak and fragmentary. So the consensus is whether it is unexplained or male infertility, one should go for single insemination. All right. So now we've decided the patient has come for IUI. So what method of sperm preparation would you choose in a patient, in a couple who's having mild male factor infertility? Dr. Manisha?
Okay. So Dr. Tanu, the patient has mild male factor infertility. What does a sperm preparation do? Washing sperms will separate the sperm from dead spermatozoa, seminal plasma, and infectious agents and dead sperms. So what it leads to a better quality of sperm, which increases the pregnancy rate and there is less complications like vasovagal syndrome, which was earlier associated with IUIs when washing was not done. So what are the 3 preparations which normally we do? There are 3 preparations: simple sperm wash, then swim up, or density gradient. If the count is normal or near normal, then we prefer swim up method, in which it is a simple method, and the recovery of sperm is also good. But still little debris and spermatozoa are there, and there is increased ROS production because of centrifugation. So in cases where the count is normal, then we prefer swim up. Now there are cases where there is severe oligoasthenoteratozoospermia. There is lots of debris. There's a lot of dead spermatozoa in the sample. In these cases, a density gradient is preferred, because in density gradient we get a lot of morphologically normal and motile sperm, and secondly, the damage to the DNA is less in cases of density gradient. Now, if you look at the evidence, the Cochrane database says that there is no difference whether you go in for a swim up or a density gradient. But there are few studies which says when there is a lot of DNA damage, then density gradient is a method that should be preferred.
So in this case, which preparation?
I would like to go for swim up.
All right. Yes, I think a good preparation is just half the victory.
Yes, surely, sure.
And as you said, that semen preparation is required to induce capacitation and to remove the detrimental factors. Also, there are 3 most important sperm washing techniques which we are usually using. And you've beautifully explained the direct swim up technique, the density gradient techniques. And I agree that the recent recommendations say that it is not possible to recommend any sperm preparation technique over another. So the Cochrane review says. So now we prepared the sperm, but one question arises: should we keep in mind about all the precautions while collection of the semen and preparation of the sperms? Dr. Akanksha?
Okay, so coming to the time interval between the sperm collection and sperm processing, ideally as per WHO guideline, the sperm preparation should start within 1 hour of semen collection, which is possible if the patient, if the patient has given sample in the center only, then it's very easy. You just take the sample, wait for liquefaction and start semen preparation. But the problem arises when the patient is not able to give sample in the center, or there is no collection center in the center, and the patient is asked to, bring the sample from home. So in that case, maximum time limit which is allowed is 1 hour. The semen preparation should at any cost start from collection of the semen to this processing of the semen should start within 1 hour.
Yes, rightly said, Dr. Akanksha. First of all, the semen collection should be as near to lab as possible. If the patient is anxious, there is performance anxiety, he wants to get the sample from home, so then we have to take few precautions. Semen specimen should be delivered to lab within 1 hour of collection. It should be protected from extremes of temperature, from sunlight. And the time interval between semen collection and preparation, it should not exceed 60 minutes. Ideal is within 30 minutes. And the time between semen preparation and insemination can be variable between 30 to 60 minutes. But as much as the time will increase, it will definitely affect the motility and the viability in the post-wash sample. So just a review of the minimum semen criteria for IUI. The pre-washed total motile sperm count should be at least 5 to 10 million. It was stated in one of the studies. Other studies say that it should be greater than 9 million. The total motility should be 30%. Post-wash morphology should be more than 4%. A minimum post-wash motile sperm count of 1 million, irrespective of sperm morphology, and total motile count to be 0.8 to 5 million. This is the post-wash count. So as we can see that different studies have given their own guidelines. So it is not possible to define the clear-cut lower level of pre or post-wash semen parameters below which IUI should be withheld. Now, Dr. Alka, very interesting question. Do you think that abstinence is required in IUI, and how much duration would you advise? Because sometimes we've seen in our OPD clinics that patients who come for giving semen, for semen analysis, they say that 5 to 7 days of abstinence nahi hai, isliye we can't give the sample. So do you think abstinence plays a very important role before IUI also?
Yes, definitely. It does, play a very important role. But I don't think so very prolonged abstinence will help a patient in any ways. As with many other things, there are no clear-cut guidelines, but WHO has said anything between 2 to 7 days is fairly good. But for all practical purposes, I advise my patients to have abstinence of 2 to 3 days only. This is the right time, because too much of abstinence will increase the number of dead sperms.
Yes,
So,
I agree with you. Initially, it was said 2 to 7 days, then ASRM came up with 2 to 5 days. Now, few studies say that 2 to 3 days of abstinence is very good. And very interesting study by Bahadur et al. Has come, which states that aggregation of consecutive ejaculates can increase pregnancy rates in oligoasthenozoospermic males also. So the consensus is that maximum production and optimum performance is a sprint, not a marathon. So avoid prolonged abstinence. 2 to 3 days is optimum. Shorter intervals for compromised semen sample, so that we aim at getting good quality rather than more quantity of sperms. Now the question comes, when should we cancel an IUI cycle? Dr. Rashmi, I have one patient. She was destined for IUI. We've given her stimulation and we have reached up to the stage of 3 dominant follicles measuring 18, 19 and 20 mm. There were 2 small follicles, 10 to 12 mm, 2 to 3 in number. So in this case, would you like to go forward or would you like to cancel?
Yeah, according to guidelines, ma'am, if there are more than two follicles of more than 15 mm or more than 5 follicles of more than 10 mm, we should not proceed with the IUI and we should cancel the IUI. If we want to do further investigations, estradiol can be done, which if E2 level is more than 1500 picogram per ml, then also we should cancel the cycle. So in this case, there are more than 2 follicles of 18, 19 mm, plus there are very small follicles also. So ideally we should cancel the cycle, and also we should instruct the patient to refrain from having intercourse, because that might also increase the chances of multifetal gestation. So further on, if we want to, we can also counsel the patient that if they want to convert to IVF, they can proceed with the IVF. So accordingly, we should proceed.
Yeah, studies also recommend that if there are more than 2 to 3 follicles measuring 15 mm or larger, we should cancel. Or if there are small intermediary follicles, greater than 5 follicles which are intermediary and which are 10 mm, in that case also we should consider to cancel the cycles. And in case if the patient doesn't want to cancel the cycle, you want to go forward, then there are secondary measures which can be taken, like aspiration of supernumerary follicles or escape IVF. All right. So now this is a very interesting case. A 30-year female married for 3 years has undergone 3 cycles of IUID with ovarian stimulation without any result. It was failure all the 3 times. Tubes are patent on HSG, good ovarian reserve, regular cycles. Would you still continue with another cycle of IUI or go for IVF? When would you say no more IUI? Dr. Alka?
maybe she is suffering of endometriosis. Has laparoscopy been done for this patient?
No, it was only HSG which was done to find the tubal status.
Okay. As per the recommendations, ASRM 2020, if the patient is not having successful IUI after 2 to 3 attempts, then it's time to go for IVF, ideally speaking. But now the patient is, with a donor cycle, then I would like to discuss with her about her success for further if she attempts for IUI. Because IUID means it's the male factor for which she has opted for IUI now. And if her laparoscopy is also, showing very normal pelvis, then we can still attempt IUI with the donor's semen sample. Otherwise, I would counsel her for a IVF cycle now.
Yes, I agree with you that in this case, it is better if we go for diagnostic laparoscopy. Even ASRM 2015 guidelines state the same, that if no pathology is identified and there has been a long duration of infertility, more than 3 years, so better do an laparoscopy to find out any other associated peritoneal factors. And coming to the number of IUI attempts, so many of the studies say that maximum of 3 to 4 cycles of IUI are enough. But here the indication is different. It is unexplained infertility and mild male factor. Also, it has been stated that more than 90% of total live birth from IUI with stimulation is achieved during first to 2 cycles. So why to give trial to later cycles? And the latest recommendations say that at least 3 consecutive IUI cycles should be performed. There is insufficient evidence to say the maximum number of IUI cycles. In NICE guideline, they have stated that we can go ahead with 12 cycles, but those are unstimulated IUI cycles. All right. So now we have given the trigger, we have called the patient, prepared the semen sample. Now we take the patient for IUI. While doing IUI, you had difficulty while negotiating the cervical canal. So what measures are you going to take, Dr. Manisha?
Okay. First of all, you have to anticipate all these things. Anticipation is the key in this kind of a scenario. And first of all, you need to see what kind of a patient it is. If the patient is very nervous, very anxious, you need to relax the patient. You need to tell him that this is just like a normal procedure where you look at the cervix, or probably a TVS which you have done. And then you need to look out for the uterus, whether it is acutely anteverted or acutely retroverted. Because if the virgin is not correct, that will also lead to difficulty while negotiating the cervix. In these cases, we should use a partially filled bladder. And if ultrasound is available, we should take help of ultrasound and try to negotiate with the help of IUI catheter. If still we are unable to do it, we can pull the cervical anterior lip of the cervix with the valsellum gently and then try to negotiate. If this doesn't work, then you can try with an ET catheter or a metal IUI catheter cannula if it is available with you. And if all these things doesn't work and still you are unable to negotiate the cervical canal, you can do an intracervical insemination for this patient. And if you are worried, you can do if you still want to do an IUI the next day, you can do a cervical dilatation today, and you can do a IUI on next day. Or if nothing works and still you are unable to negotiate the cervix, there is acute cervical stenosis, then probably you need to post this patient for hysteroscopy in the next sitting.
Okay. All right. Now, in this case, would you like to go for regular ultrasound in all the IUI cases? Because at certain setups, people don't have access to ultrasound facility. So, Dr. Akanksha, do you think ultrasound is necessary while doing IUI?
Dr. Tanu, this question actually has been addressed in various RCTs. I would like to mention there are 2 RCTs. One was one out of which one is a very recent one, that whether routine use of ultrasound in IUI is going to improve the success rate or not. And it has been seen that if we start using ultrasound in each and every case of IUI, the success rate remains more or less the same. So no, ultrasound is not needed for every case of IUI, and I would reserve the use of ultrasound only in difficult IUI cases.
And the use of these tenaculums are going to affect the hard catheter or the soft catheter. Does it make any difference in the live birth rates?
No. The success in the live birth rate remains the same whether you are using soft catheter or hard catheter or you are using a tenaculum. But definitely the patient's comfort level is, get disturbed. The patient don't feel very comfortable with these instruments. But the success rate does not get affected with these.
All right. Yeah. So just a review of all these things. Causes of difficult IUI can be acutely anteverted uterus, acutely retroverted uterus, stenosed cervix, abnormal cervical canal, or apprehensive patient. Now, how to manage, as Dr. Manisha beautifully elaborated, that half-filled bladder is a better option. Gentle traction can be given. Insemination can be performed under ultrasound guidance, but this is for difficult inseminations. Patient counseling is very important, and malleable cannula can be helpful. Then again, when we compare the ultrasound guidance with clinical touch, it will not make any difference. Tenaculum will also not make any difference. Soft and hard catheters will also not make any difference on the live birth rate, as the Cochrane database study says. Okay, so now we have done the IUI. So in this case, do you prefer to give luteal support, in which we have just used oral ovulagens, Dr. Rashmi?
There is insufficient evidence to support that if you use oral ovulagens like CC or Letrozole, there is no need of luteal phase support, as there is endogenous LH which produces progesterone. But if we are using gonadotropin cycles, we need to give luteal phase support to the patient. in the form of micronized vaginal progesterone, 200 milligram 2 times a day.
Till how long would you like to give it?
Till 8 to 10 weeks till the luteoplacental shift occurs.
Okay. I agree with you that progesterone luteal phase support is beneficial only in patients undergoing ovulation induction with gonadotropins. It did not benefit in ovulation induction cycles where CC or letrozole was used, and luteal support should continue up to 8 to 10 weeks. So now the IUI has been done. You've given instructions to the patient, given luteal support in case if you had used gonadotropins. Would you advise rest to this patient? The question goes to Dr. Manisha.
Okay. So 10 minutes rest can be advised to the patients, and we have seen in a lot of RCTs and systematic reviews that it has been shown that if you give a patient a rest of 10 minutes, that will certainly has a positive effect on your pregnancy, and there is an increase in pregnancy rate if a 10 minutes rest is given after an IUI.
All right, yes, there have been studies. The older study said that 10 minutes rest is good. But the latest study, ESHRE study, which was presented in ESHRE in 2016, stated that immobilization will not make any difference. But still, 10 minutes rest will not make any difference. So we can go ahead with the 10 minutes rest after IUI. I agree with you. Okay, now a thoughtful transition which we have to make. According to you, Dr. Akanksha, when should the clinician and the patient stop expecting and start accepting that one has to move from IUI to IVF?
Dr. Danu, this decision is easier in cases with unexplained infertility and mild male factor infertility, where the patient has undergone 3 to 4 cycles of IUI and has failed. This patient should be directly referred for IVF. Now, if during the course of treatment, when to refer the patient IVF earlier, it depends. Suppose if we have taken the patient for IUI and we see that the post-wash the sperm parameters have deteriorated. So if the inseminating motile sperm concentration is very less, like less than 1 million, then this patient should not be taken up for IUI, rather should be referred for IVF. Suppose we were doing IUI and we decided to do a laparoscopy in the patient and we see that patient has got severe endometriosis. We have found grade 3, grade 4 endometriosis. Then these patients should also be referred for IVF. And definitely if the age of the female has increased, it has crossed 38 years of age or 40 years of age, then she should ideally be referred for in IVF treatment.
Yes, I agree with you, but before starting for IUI, a proper counseling of the patient is very important. We have to tell the patient about the success rate in per cycle as well as the cumulative success rates. And definitely we have to refer the patient for IVF if there is increased duration of infertility, if the female age is more, there are associated male factor, endometriosis, and after 3 to 4 failed cycles of IUI with ovarian stimulation. So now we come to the conclusion that IUI is the first line treatment option in unexplained infertility, mild male factor, donor inseminations. It is simple, safe, non-invasive and cost-effective technique. Careful selection of patient is very important before we go for IUI. And the important predictors are the female age, total motile sperm count, duration of infertility, failure of 3 to 4 cycles of stimulated IUI. Then in this case, we should move to IVF. Stimulated IUI cycles with oral ovulagens are better with respect to multiple pregnancy and live birth rate. Single insemination is always better. Studies say that between 24 to 40 hours we can do the insemination. At our practice, we are usually doing between 36 to 38 hours. And luteal support is not required in CC and letrozole cycle. So I would like to end my presentation that our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. And this is a true statement during this time also, during this corona crisis also.